Hi, everyone. I have a really special guest this show. His name is Diesen. He is a Norwegian professor and commentator and author of about, many books about Russia and geopolitics in general. He is a fascinating person. I met him at the Reade discussion club that we were at in Sochi, Russia. And I feel really happy that he's going to be joining us today with commentary about what's going on in the world. So please join us and listen to what he has to say about just the more recent things that are happening in the world of geopolitics. So I will see you on YouTube, Rumble, X, Satara Reade Show. Thanks for joining. Hey, Glenn, thank you so much for joining us. And, my audience with my podcast is a lot in the West and actually as well as the East. I have some people in China and Russia, some in Africa and the global South, but I have a great number of people in America watching and in Europe. In particular, Great Britain and such. So, I met you at Reade and I was so impressed with you and impressed with everything that you had to say. So thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Thank you so much. It's very kind of you to say. And it's good to see you again.
Yeah, Reade discussion group was quite something and a very historic event. And I thought that President Putin had a lot of really interesting things to say. And it's too bad that the mainstream media in the Western Hemisphere wouldn't cover it, because I think people could learn a lot from just listening directly to the president of Russia.
Oh, I agree, and it says something different about the climate in this new Cold War. I think often people feel comfortable to withdraw into this familiarity of a Cold War, but there's a lot less confidence in the West this time around, not just economically, but it's worth noting that during the Cold War, we're allowed to know the arguments of Moscow. We could counter the arguments, we could discuss the merit of it, but this time around, this not really, most people are quite unfamiliar with it, and even the people who are familiar with it would be cautious to say it out loud because it can be interpreted as support, which is now effectively criminalized. So it's journalism, academia, nothing really works as it should, and the great benefits that comes with it, as long as we have this this new push for censorship. So
speaking of censorship, my podcast gets out there. It's going to be on YouTube and it's out on X and whatnot, so people have access. But again, it's not mainstream media. It's not although I think mainstream media is kind of flailing in the United States, at least. I don't know about Europe, but I wanted to jump right in because we are in my opinion, the most dangerous point in history I think we've ever been, with two nuclear powers really facing off. America kind of in an upheaval of a very big transition of political parties with very different ideologies. Hopefully this one isn't as hawkish as the last one, but what we're seeing is that Biden on his way out really escalated things. So could you, for my audience, kind of educate them on why Biden's decision to allow these long-range missiles and what that meant to Russia from that perspective?
Well, there's been a gradual escalation all along, but this new thing now, which Biden did after the Democrats lost the election, I think everyone recognized now this is to spoil Trump's efforts to make peace with Russia. It's not that dissimilar from what Obama did at the end of 2016 by throwing a wrench into the diplomacy with the Russians. But what Biden has done is so much worse, because what he has effectively done is to engage in direct attack on Russia. Now, of course, it's difficult to define when you cross the line between proxy war and direct war, but I think these long-range missiles are a clear breach of this line, because it's often presented quite harmlessly as, well, as Ukraine has the right to defend themselves. Sure, and so we're giving them weapons. Nothing. Why is any problem with this? And it frames the problem. They frames it incorrectly. I mean, everyone's supposed to buy into the premise. Ukraine has a right to defend itself. Sure, everyone buys into the premise, but then the conclusion is, so we give them weapons. But the Ukrainians won't use these weapons. It's no secret that the technical skills and the complexity in operating these missiles makes it impossible for the Ukrainians to use it. These missiles can only be used by American technicians. So it doesn't have to be officially American soldiers, but there has to be at least technicians and former soldiers who now work as mercenaries then for Ukraine, but they still have to cooperate with American intelligence agencies. So the targeting of these missiles, the intelligence, they rely on also American, again, the technicians, soldiers firing them, Americans, then they will be guided by American missiles. So this is an American attack on Russia, and it's not something that they might do, it's something they have already done. And this is why it's so extremely dangerous. And now, given that the Americans are doing it, the British and the French are following along. There's been some push for Germany to do the same. Olaf Scholz was supposed to, well, he's been opposing it, but the bit of a failed palace coup, if you will, make sure that he's still in power until Trump takes over. So they won't have their election until February. So most likely Germany won't join in on the attack of Russia. But I agree with your assessment. This is the most dangerous time we've ever been in, at least in the Cuban Missile Crisis. You have people pushing for peace. This is now absent. It's not existent, and you're not allowed to talk about peace either. So this is, again, I think this is, very much agree with you, the most dangerous point we have ever been.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely noticed there's an absence of communication, an absence of diplomacy, and it makes everything really tense and very, unsettled, because you have a motivation, it seems, from the Western hawks, particularly, from the US, that seem to want to keep going. Now, you saw Russia answer over the last few days with their missile system. What I saw from my end, and I'll give you, I don't know what you saw from the European end, but from the American end, what I saw was a scramble. The Pentagon canceled a briefing and then scrambled and had it the next day. They didn't expect that type of missile. They were unaware of that new technology, and you can see them spinning right now about it. Do you think that message that President Putin sent, because no civilians were killed, I think it was a military installation that was hit, a manufacturing. What is your read on that message that President Putin sent back? Because he said clearly this was the message for the West, for the US. What are your thoughts about it?
This is quite severe. It's an ICBM with a multi-entry delivery vehicle. So it's sends in a missile splitting into many warheads which are striking. So this is a huge, a big deal. The problem for the Russians is that during the past rounds of escalation, when they failed to retaliate, we say in the West, well, the Russians are, they're deterred, they're weak, they don't dare to respond against NATO, so we can continue to escalate. Now that Russia is responding, it's we say it's a grave escalation. The Russians are aggressive, they're threatening everyone. So there's no recognition that there's a tit for tat, that there's that they also have that they're under great pressure. Because if you've seen over the past 3 years, with every time NATO escalates, again, we can't call it escalation, even though back in days Biden himself said that sending F-16s is a declaration, or not a declaration, called this would mean World War III. Now, of course, we're saying, no, we can send F-16s, it's not an escalation. So it's very dishonest. But if you point out the dishonesty, they simply say, well, now that's what Putin wants us to think, that's what Kremlin is saying. So, if you take our side, you repeat our talking points, but you're saying what Kremlin is. So, so we can't even discuss it. But obviously, this is very dishonest. We are escalating, and Russia is responding. And this has been the main challenge, I think, for Moscow, because every time NATO escalates, what should it do? On one hand, if it retaliates and continues up the escalatory ladder, then they might risk Third World War, a nuclear exchange with NATO, which is not desirable. But if they don't retaliate, then NATO says, well, they're weak, we can continue further to escalate. And this is what we've done over the past 3 years. There's no denying this. This is what we see when you open the newspapers. Putin set red lines before, he doesn't uphold them. So it's very dangerous for them not to escalate either when the West is escalating. So they have to retaliate. So I think this was intended as the go-between. That is, let's wait a bit before we blow up, American military assets over the Black Sea, or we attack some weapon depot in Poland, logistics centers in Romania, shoot down satellites. Let this be the final warning. This very powerful weapon. And it's not clear if it's been received, because the media, of course, they're following the narrative. My hope is that behind the nonsense which comes out in the media, you actually have some sensible people. And my suspicion is that the sensible people, that we kind of have to rely on Washington, because the Europeans, I think, have very much lost their minds. I think they take great pride in the idea that we're not scared of, we won't let ourselves be intimidated, we're not scared of nuclear war, which is a ridiculous thing to say. We don't even call it nuclear deterrent anymore, we call it nuclear blackmail, so we can't give into it. I mean, it's been so, it's gone so far now that I'm hoping that in the military ranks in the United States, someone will hit the brakes, because the way the Russians see it, they have their backs against the walls. They can't accept having NATO effectively bombing their cities without doing
Yeah.
anything.
Yeah, I am getting that message too, that it just seems that there's putting Russia in an impossible position in order to retaliate. They're goading it on. They're poking the bear, so to speak, and they've gotten a response. Now, it seems to me that I think that what really caught them unaware was the new technology. Okay, that was obvious. That was, so now they're probably wondering what else they don't know. And so maybe that's put some of it on the back heel, just that alone. But I wanted to ask you, because as we come up into this week and we come up into the getting closer to when Donald Trump finally takes power, how do you see this unraveling, this path? Do you feel like it's going to at some point de-escalate, or what is a way that a better path can be chosen? What do you see diplomatically?
Hopefully there will be an end in this escalation, because I think we've been pushing up the escalation ladder for so long. But I really think this is the end of the line. It's impossible now for Russia not to retaliate. So my best hope is that there's someone pushing for the brakes.
Do you see that in Europe at all? Anybody on the European side?
Well, the Europeans will do what the Americans say. This is simple truth. I mean, the reason why the British and the French, especially the British, been pushing very hard to send their missiles for a long time, but the Americans told them no, and they do as they're told. They waited until the US to approve this, and then they went along as well. So I think the change has to come from the United States. I think it can't come from the Europeans.
And historically, looking back at Ukraine, you have to understand in America, I can't speak for Europe, but in America, most citizens don't even know where Ukraine is on a map, right? Realistically, like I've had to show when I was teaching, political science or doing whatever, I would have to show students like where it is. Like, I mean, they don't know. So there's no emotional investment into this war. And you saw the way people voted there. American citizens don't want to be at war with Russia, or they don't want this proxy war being fought in Ukraine. But it seems different in Europe. I don't know. Europe has a different history, of course, with Russia, but there seems to be a lot more bravado and a lot more kind of thumping of the chest. Could you speak a little bit about historically why that is, particularly from countries like Finland, Norway, Poland?
Well, the Scandinavians, to me, honestly, is a bit of a mystery, because if you take my country, Norway, during the entire Cold War, the point of departure when you look at security is what enhances our security. Now, then you have to find a balance. One hand, you want to deter the Soviets, but you also don't want to provoke them. And again, this is a security competition. How do you protect yourself without provoking the adversary? This is a balance you need to maximize your security. So we joined NATO, but did not have any foreign troops on our soil, and avoided having too much American and British activity in the high north. I think also some knowledge that our interests are not completely overlapped. That is, we want stable borders. The United States might want to test the Soviet defenses and provoke if required. But this time around, all this balance is gone. The politicians speak like cartoon characters. Everything is a conflict between good and evil. If we don't do anything, the Russians will come and take us. America will protect us. No one discusses the idea that perhaps, even though we're allies, our interests might not overlap completely. Again, you can't open a newspaper or see any news channel where they even discuss Russian security concerns. How can you enhance your own security if you can't recognize what your adversaries fear? The seemingly no problem. Just fuel up the border with weapons, invite the Americans, and everything is about deterrent. No one is even thinking about the fact that we might provoke. So it's a very strange environment. And I think across Europe, I think many were shocked in the beginning of 2022. They were taken off guard, the invasion of Ukraine. Many went into panic. So when the Americans suggested, put up the deal, we can defeat the Russians on the battlefield, collapse their economy, isolate them in the world. It was seen as something that can put the Russians back into check. You revive the unipolar moment. So we go a little bit back to the 90s. Again, everyone signed up for this. And I think once the mistake had been done, they just simply doubled down, because I think rhetorically they painted themselves into a corner. Nothing of what we're doing now makes any sense. But everyone is nonetheless so convinced of their own virtue. That is, you saw this as well. People who wouldn't know where it is on the map, had no idea about the background. They nonetheless are convinced completely that this is, about an evil authoritarian empire trying to crush fresh, young, thriving democracy. So there's all context is gone. And when they, for example, boycott all diplomacy for 3 years, now they're trying to make it sound as it was the Russians who broke it off, but the Russians never did. They always kept the door open for diplomacy. It was us, it was our side that broke all diplomacy. So when you ask how can you know, hundreds of thousands of young men dying on the front line, and there's no one who wants to even sit down with the Russians to find a way, at least if we can reduce the violence, prevent escalation, maybe get peace agreement, anything, nothing. But they still treat this as some kind of a moral statement. I mean, the new foreign policy chief of the EU, Callas, just like, oh, Putin is war criminals. We don't talk to war criminals because we are so good. And this is supposed to be a good thing, that we don't talk to the opponent when you have hundreds of thousands of people dying. You could actually do something. Instead, they behave like 12-year-old girls in the schoolyard, trying to freeze each other out and isolate. It's beyond absurd. We have politicians or diplomats who don't believe in diplomacy. We have journalists who don't believe in freedom of speech. It's a very strange time to be alive.
It is, and on that note, on freedom of speech, there's been so much censorship. As you know, both of us have been on RT and done that, but now it's banned in a lot of European countries. I don't know about Norway, but in America, it was taken down. It's taken off the cable channels, and now it's actually illegal for Americans to work for RT. It's against the law, and it's I think that they're trying to. It was an executive order that was done by Biden, not a law passed through Congress, but Biden put this executive order in, and I think it's up to 10 years in prison. Is the consequence for doing that. So that's really startling, and no one in the mainstream is talking about it. It's really shocking. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about censorship and RT and everything else, because RT, I'm using them as an example, but there was, Sputnik as well and others, but it was anything to do that might have been showing a different lens, showing a different point of view from the East, whether it be China, Russia, whatever. What are your thoughts on this, and what are you seeing in the European side?
And this is a consequence of propaganda, I think. That is, if you believe that the world is good versus evil, then the good, hating the evil is a good thing. It becomes good hatred. So you do collective punishment of all Russians. Yeah, well, they kind of deserve it. We are, there's all our principles go out the window. So I think this is a big part of the source. But in the EU also banned RT, Sputnik, the Russian ones. Norway is not a part of the EU, so we still have it up, which is good for the freedom of speech. But again, it's quite silly, because if you look at the original literature on propaganda, the main argument is that propaganda is the best way to fight it is with open discourse, present both sides and have a debate. That was the idea back in the day. Have a debate between Churchill and Stalin, like let them talk openly. But a second thing is also propaganda is often, as we learn in communication theories, is stronger if it's actually delivered through an intermediary, because who delivers the message, if they're perceived to be objective and ideally altruistic, then the message is more convincing. But everyone knows that RT is funded by the Russian state. Everyone knows. I mean, you can't go a day without anyone calling them for propaganda. So it's not a good delivery tool of propaganda to begin with. And again, I think it's quite absurd, because we're not allowed to argue what the Russian perspective is in the West now. You will call them with great social cost, and we're not allowed to see what the Russians are saying, to familiarize ourselves with their arguments. So it's a very dangerous censorship. And indeed, when you call something propaganda in order to censor, this is actual propaganda. This is how you propagandize a public. And for me, the whole thing is very strange, because I noticed it in this country too. I don't write for RT anymore. I did before the invasion. I write on Substack, and I tell anyone, you can please go ahead. You can republish anywhere you want. So if you're Swiss, German, Italian, they all republish my articles. Also Russia, and then I'm accused of propaganda because it's published then on RT, and they say, well. And I wonder, what do they think propaganda is? I mean, when it's translated into Italian or German, then it's okay. Once it's translated into Russian, magically it becomes propaganda. It's very strange. And no one explains any of this. Instead, I see this, they use this against academics as well. They say, something is Russia friendly, propaganda is disinformation. It's what Putin wants to hear. All these things, they never explained. And this is the vulgarity of the whole thing. People are prepared to throw around these very crude accusations, and there's no need to ever prove it. And but it's enough to silence and to censor. So it's terrible time for freedom of speech, I think. And the irony is it's very bad for our security as well. If you want to have course correction, first you have to discuss where are we going wrong. If you want to respond to the adversaries' policies, first you have to know what the policies consist of. That is, what are they afraid of? How are they reacting? I'm a professor in Norway. I would never dare to teach a class here on Russian politics. I've written 11 books on Russian politics, but I would never teach it because it would go 1 week before a journalist would say, oh, well, he said that Russia perhaps sees NATO as a threat, so this is what the Kremlin says, so this is Russian propaganda, have him kicked out. So you have to be very cautious, and this is not healthy for if you want to have an enlightened public. Instead, you fuel the ignorance and hatred instead, and that's usually not a good recipe for peace and stability.
No, because you want like a robust dialogue, and what better place to have it is in academia when you have young students coming up, another generation coming up, and now what they're being filled with is this very xenophobic approach to other countries, to Russia, not just to Russia and the United States, it's to China and Iran. In the United States, it's become more and more isolationist, in my opinion, in that regard. It's just become more xenophobic and more just very much rejecting any other point of view other than the Western hegemony. Anything else is bad, and that almost reaches nationalism, which is and you and I both know, as studying history, that's a dark path to go down. We all know how that ends, right? Could you talk a little bit about yourself? You mentioned you're a professor, how your awakening kind of came to how one-sided this conversation was. Mine started in the mid-90s when I worked for Biden, because he was very anti-Russia then, very hawkish. I knew, in fact, in 2019, I publicly said, if you elect Joe Biden to the presidency, he will start a war with Russia. I got in a lot of trouble for saying that in American media, but it ended up unfortunately happening. So what kind of led to your awakening, and what things in your career path led you to how you're kind of dissecting the information today?
Yeah, long story. I was in the 90s, I was actually quite optimistic about unification of Europe. We get rid of the dividing line simply because we had the security agreements with the Russians then, such as the Charter of Paris for New Europe, all of this pledging to remove dividing lines, to have indivisible security. So I was in the army in the end of the 90s when we instead decided to expand NATO, which canceled these agreements, and then attack Yugoslavia without the UN mandate. So for me, this was, let's say, disappointing. And I also, initially I studied business, but I lived in Russia first time in 2006, and I thought it was fascinating, the narratives which are told, because it always struck me that we're talking about the same historical events, but there's no comparisons, no overlap at all. It's like talking about two different worlds, and
right.
And there's a lot of fake around what we have been saying. Anyways, my PhD initially was about the failure to establish a common European security architecture after the Cold War. And it's not a difficult point to argue, because in the 90s, even Bill Clinton recognized that if we expand NATO, we're going to re-divide the continent. His defense minister, William Perry, threatened to quit because of this, because it was a horrible idea. He had people, George Kennan, James Baker, all of them recognized that this would be considered a stab in the back against the Russians. Even Kennan, I argued back in the day then that in 98, I think it was, that one day the Russians will start to retaliate and push back, and then we're just gonna claim that this is just how Russians are, that they're aggressive. And so he essentially warned about this time which would come. And so my main focus was on this area. Sorry, that was a bit of a sidetrack. Look how our failure to establish a common European security architecture. Now, after 2014, something huge happened in Russia. That is, when we toppled the government in Ukraine, you still had a powerful group in Russia who believed that there could be an incremental integration into the West. So slowly we could become, this greater Europe based on Gorbachev's common European home. But when we toppled the government in Ukraine, we effectively were making it into a front line against the Russians. And it was a front line. Keep in mind, as New York Times posted, on the first day after the coup, the security services of the government, the Americans installed in Ukraine, formed a partnership with CIA and MI6 for covert war against the Russians. This is on day one, before the Russians done anything at all. So from this on, the Russians no longer believed in this gradual integration with the West, and instead they began to shift to the East, their entire economy. And this is how they made their economy sanction-proof. And again, I said this as well in the beginning of 2022, because this has been my main research interest for the past 10 years. Only Greater Eurasia, because initially I looked at the failure of Greater Europe, and then I spent 10 years on Greater Eurasia. So I said from day one as well, from 2022, the sanctions can't possibly work. The Russians can diversify away from Europe. Europe can't diversify away from Russia. But again, we don't have discussions, we don't have any dialogue. So they just said, well, if you don't support the sanctions, the Russians don't support the sanctions. Now you're repeating what Putin's saying. You should repeating what we're saying if you take our side. So suddenly you're spreading Russian propaganda. And here we are 3 years later. Germany's economy is in shatter. It's going into deindustrialization. Europe's becoming more and more irrelevant. Russia, meanwhile, climbed up a step and now is the fourth largest economy and continues to grow. So everything I said was right. I warned about this war in 2013. I warned that we should implement the Minsk agreement for 7 years. I warned that the war would come. I wrote actually in 2021 that the war would probably come. They say, you're legitimizing Russian invasion. So there's no one cares anymore about realities and facts. It's all about conforming to the narrative. Either you conform or you're spreading propaganda, and there's no discussion at all. It's impossible to actually have any discussion in this climate. So at least for me, I think it's easier to deal with academics abroad, because within the country there's too many NGOs, as we call them, which are financed by the US government, who comes to strangle, trying to smear you. Never ever do they have a single cohesive argument. It's always just slurs and slander, propaganda, repeating Putin's point. And no one ever questions whether or not you've been right in everything you said for the past 15 years or so. They just want to know whether or not you deviated from the narrative.
That's such an interesting way to put it, and it's true. And what strikes me is that it seems like we've moved forward with technology a bit in the last decade or so, of course, with social media and everything, but yet there's this, with mainstream media, there's this lack of emotional intelligence. This lack of emotional intelligence from, I'm talking about the US leaders, there's with as far as diplomacy and approaches, and it's really disappointing, and it's now to the point of disappointing, it's to the point of being frightening, because the results could be the loss of humanity, life as we know it. And most certainly, at the very minimum, it would be, some very bad things happening in Europe. In America, we've been rather sheltered from direct wars, as except for 9/11, the Terrorist Act. But besides that, it's been a long time since there's been anything on American soil. This might change that. But now you have Donald Trump coming in hard, saying he wants to broker a peace. He really wants this. He's got people around him that are not hawks. There's more doves than hawks. However, the Pentagon is a different story. And then some of his appointments are pretty hawkish, particularly towards China. Looking at it as a whole, what are the pros and cons that you see right now happening with Trump coming into office? And what is the best hope out of that?
I guess his biggest strength is the fact that he wants to end the war, to have peace, because no one has talked about peace for 3 years now, and whenever they talk about peace, it's peace through war. So Jens Stoltenberg's idea that weapons are the path to peace, but beyond this militaristic approach that once we destroyed Russia, then there will be peace. There's no one who actually talked about peace. So the fact that Trump wants it, I think, is positive. I think he's genuine as well. I think he's I wouldn't see him as a peacenik or anything, but I think he sees foreign affairs very much in a pragmatic way, very transactional, which could be a positive things as well. But Ukraine is becoming a loss. The Americans are losing a lot of money, and also this is a concern to him. He's also worried that this pushing Russia further and further towards China. This is also a reason why he doesn't want this. And also the war can't really be won anymore. Why would you continue fighting a losing war. Even if you are one of the NATO hawks, how they defined the war in the beginning in terms of bleeding Russia, it suggests that a good war would be if you have stagnant front lines where the Ukrainians and Russians keep killing each other. Then it's a good war in terms of bleeding and weakening Russia. This was, again, as very clearly confirmed with the sabotage of the Istanbul Agreement. This was the purpose. But once you see that the Ukrainian army, that is your proxy, is beginning to collapse, now you're going to see huge territorial shifts, because in wars of attrition, the territorial shifts come after the collapse. So now that the army is collapsing, why would you continue the war then? Then it's in your interest to find a peace, which is why suddenly some journalists now are starting to talk about freezing the front lines and, let's rearm Ukraine. That's not going to happen. So anyways, I think that Trump is quite genuine, but I think that his main problem is this idea that he can solve it in 24 hours. I think he can put immense pressure on the Ukrainians, given that America is keeping Ukraine afloat. However, what is the deal he's going to offer to the Russians? Because Russia already officially annexed these 4 territories. Now, the main ingredient of any peace agreement has to be for Ukraine to restore its neutrality. Now, this is a difficult sell to Ukraine, of course, because, keep in mind, no one, I think, has suffered greater than the Ukrainians in this war. All the people that have been lost territory, they suffered greatly. So it's going to be very hard for them to accept a peace settlement where they get no security guarantees at all and they have to demilitarize to a large extent. But this has to be the foundation of it. Ukraine has to restore its neutrality to mitigate the security competition that was intensified when NATO began to push for expanding to Ukraine. This is what triggered the security competition. But making matters more challenging is, of course, that, as I mentioned, Russia has annexed these 4 territories: Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. This is now effectively become also a war about contested territory. And I think this could make it much more difficult for Trump if he says, let's freeze the front lines. That's not good enough for Russia. They need guarantees that Ukraine will be neutral. That means not just officially promise won't join NATO. It needs it also from NATO, but also no more de facto membership. That is, NATO countries can't simply pour in weapons in the years to come and fill up the front line with missiles aimed at Moscow and then prepare for a future war. Can Trump deliver this and full neutrality for Ukraine, as well as huge territorial concessions? Keeping in mind some of these territories Russia's not even controlling at the moment. So it's going to be very difficult for Trump. If he's a great negotiator, how can he bring this deal to his own public and to his allies? So it's going to be extremely difficult. So my main concern is what happens when Trump doesn't get his deal? Because his main impulse is always, okay, well, then I put max pressure. And then you're going to have another Biden. Yeah. It can go a bit either way. But again, at least I'm happy someone's talking about peace again. This is, positive.
The big step. And you have people like Tulsi Gabbard, who I actually met her when I was at the Rage Against the War Machine regarding, the proxy war in DC a couple of years ago. She sincerely is against it. So is RFK Jr. So he has people around him immediately that are around him. It's just the question of the Pentagon, because, you still have a lot of the bureaucrats, right? Because they still have a lot of power. And obviously, there was a lot of money made in the United States, unfortunately. Now, in my opinion, and this is my opinion, there was a lot of corruption around Ukraine regarding the Biden family. I think that they were personally enriched, and I have reasons to believe that. Whether they'll be held accountable, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if Biden will be held accountable for what he did for the personal enrichment. But as we move forward, what are your thoughts, on projects that you're doing right now? And how can my audience get in touch with you or hear more or read your books and that kind of thing?
I mostly publish on my Substack, so please go visit and subscribe. Otherwise, I also post most publications on Twitter. Written 11 books, so please order one. The last book I wrote actually was on the Ukraine war. The title is The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order, so pointing out that the Ukraine war is not just a consequence of a collapsing unipolarity, but it's also intensifying the shift towards a multipolar world order organized largely around the major Eurasian powers. So which has been very well received. People like John Mersheimer, Alistair Crook, you have Ray McGovern, it's Chas Freeman, Jack Matlock, your last ambassador to the Soviet Union. All this people have given its endorsements, so it's done quite well. Also being translated into 10 languages, so it's doing well. So please order a book or or just
Yeah.
follow my articles. So
Yeah, and I think it's important our audience hears that, because we need to support people that are independent publishers and independent, in their thinking. And you're I've read a lot of your work, and I've always learned a great deal from it. It's informed.
I forgot to say.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Also, yeah, we're running a podcast series as well. It's on the Duran.
Okay.
We usually actually most of our guests would be American, so either retired politicians, military, people from intelligence, but we also do a lot of ambassadors, some academics, and the main idea is effectively to interview experts, which has important information and insights, but nobody wants to hear from anymore because they reached the wrong conclusion. So, for example, Jack Matlock, he contributed to negotiating an end to the Cold War. And he's very critical of how NATO has provoked a war in Ukraine. So, of course, and also unraveled the negotiations they did. Now, if it's very hard to accuse him of spreading Russian propaganda. So what do you do if you can't dismiss him? Well, you just simply don't bring him on. So nobody mentioned. So all these important voices, which doesn't fit the narrative anymore. We also include that in the Duran podcast. So again, I think it has about 440,000 subscribers now. So it's doing quite well. Nice. So yeah, go to Rumble or YouTube or any of these channels.
Well, thank you for sharing that with my audience, and we'll make sure and have the links available if people look on our YouTube and Telegram and whatnot. So I wanted to thank you for your time and energy today. Any last final thoughts on our discussion that you'd like to share with the audience, just in the next couple of weeks, because we're in such a tense moment right now worldwide?
Again, a strange time to be alive. That we're waiting for Donald Trump effectively to save the world. This is okay. Someone would have told you 10 years ago. That sounds like a very absurd notion. But this is the case now, because I think once the election was lost, they went into spoiling the election, the victory, the ability of Trump to make peace. So doing very crazy escalations now. Just I guess last comment is what I always argue to my students when I teach security strategy and security politics is put yourself always in the shoes of the opponent. It's important to be able to see it from their perspective if you're going to make reasonable predictions about what they would do. Now, what would the United States do if you're sitting in the United States, if the Russians had or Chinese had, not just topple the government in Mexico, but then begin to send in all its weapon systems, planning to pull it into a military alliance. And then as a conflict breaks out, it would start now, the point we're now, the Russians would send missiles to Mexico or Cuba, which already has a president, to Cuba. The missiles would then begin to be launched against America into the United States. The missiles would not just be Russian, they would be operated by Russians, they would be using Russian targeting, Russian intelligence, they would be guided by the Russian satellites. The Cubans effectively would do nothing except maybe symbolically press a button for formality. What would the United States do? Would it say, oh, well, I guess Cuba has a right to defend itself? Or would they see this as a direct attack by Russia? So I think now, again, it's a
very good analogy.
Yeah, so just this, it's very difficult these days. Putting yourself in the shoes of the opponent, which is step one, is considered treason these days. But if you can't do this, there's very little chance that we'll make it to January 20th.
That's really wise thoughts. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate your time. I look forward to seeing more of you speaking, because your voice is still being heard. Thank goodness. We need your voice. And it was fascinating hearing you at the Valdai Discussion Club. I hope to see you there next year. I hope to see you soon. Take good care, Glenn, and let's hope for world peace. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Hope to see you again.